Do you found the skeleton? How would you tell it's a representative? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left off, Sanford was basically up to his neck in lying about his sources. Shocking, I know. And he was telling us about how Darwin didn't understand cells or abiogenesis, which, obviously. Anyway, back to the man himself.
But how can we glorify a man who had such little knowledge of the biological science?
Just don't. Feel free to ignore him and only pay attention to current biology. It'll leave you with the same result. Common ancestry is a fact. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old or so, and humans are absolutely apes.
He didn't know about cell biology, biochemistry, molecular biology, Mendelian genetics, mutations, DNA, genetic code, genomics, population information, population genetics, neurobiology, and about 100 other fields of science.
Sure didn't, and neither did the author of Genesis 30, which is why neither of them really matter in modern science. But the difference is one of them was right about something pretty significant in biology, that is natural selection and sexual selection, and of course, common ancestry. And the other was basically wrong about all of biology except that animals mate to reproduce. So one is celebrated in science for getting something right, but not worshipped as infallible, and the other is ignored in science because they made literally no contribution to science.
Again, to be kind to him, everyone in that era didn't know these things. But we have to understand for him that life was something that could be easily explained away as a little bit of clay that is malleable and could be shaped by circumstance.
Why? And I really mean this. Why do we need to understand that? What does it matter? I have no clue why creationists think that pointing out that Darwin was wrong and lived in the past is anything but a waste of time. Everyone knows that. No one really cares. Is it just as simple, as I often assume, that creationists just think that since they are in a religion with prophets, whose word is said to be the unquestionable word of God, and so they think that the way they treat Moses or Jesus or Muhammad is the same way that scientists treat Darwin? Is it really that simple and inane? If you watching this at home, sitting there, probably on your phone, on the toilet, have any ideas? Let me know in the comments, especially you, Susan. Yeah, I see you there thinking I'm just trying to use your name randomly as a joke. I'm not. You should comment to tell me what you think about this confusing and nonsense trend among anti-evolutionists.
So here's a really telling story about Darwin. He wrote to a friend this line in some correspondence: "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick."
I can sense the lie coming, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced.
What's he talking about?
He's talking about the fact that peacock tail fans are beautiful but maladaptive, and he couldn't seem to reconcile the hindrance the tail put on a peacock's survival with the idea of natural selection. But what does Sanford think he's talking about?
He means that he became violently ill. He was a tormented man.
Here, Sanford spends entirely too long explaining that Darwin had a weak stomach and vomited a lot. I can't see how that detail matters, nor do I care to contest it, so we'll move on with the rest of the point, although Sanford blames this on Darwin being spiritually messed up. No, he doesn't give a citation.
He literally became sick when he looked at a beautiful feather because he couldn't explain it away. The complexity of something as simple as a feather upset his whole worldview.
And there's the lie. So this letter isn't overly long. Let's just read it. My dear Gray, although I have nothing in particular to say to you, I must thank you for your pleasant letter of March 19th. But let me say, I know what a busy man you are, and pray do not waste more of your time over me. My book, your review, and letters, etc., etc., must have consumed an awful amount. In one sense, the time spent on review has not been wasted, for I feel sure, and I have again, third time, read it all consecutively, that it will produce great effect in leading people to think, and that is all I wish. Hooker indeed tells me he knows cases where your article has had this effect and has greatly mollified opposition to my book. I agree largely with what you say about Varicose theory, hypothesis. Indeed, on reading your whole review in one read, I saw that some of my remarks were rather superfluous. It is curious that I remember well time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over, But I have got over this stage of the complaint, and now small trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Under this point of view, your story of the black pigs in the Everglades delights me, and supports other cases, which, though founded on very good evidence, I could hardly digest. Pray keep Professor Wyman up to the mark about writing to me. I should also look at it with great honor and favor if you possibly can find out the name positively of the red nuts. I shall be very curious to see Agassiz's remarks. I met a few days ago Professor Cook of your Cambridge, and he brought me direct from Agassiz all sorts of very civil speeches. What can this mean? I do hope to God A is a sincere man. I had always fancied that he was so. You may like to hear about reviews on my book. Sedgwick, as I and Lyell feel certain from internal evidence, has reviewed me savagely and unfairly in Spectator. The notice includes much abuse and is hardly fair in several respects. He would actually lead anyone who was ignorant of geology to suppose that I had invented the great gaps between successive geological formations, instead of it being an almost universally admitted dogma. But my dear old friend Sedgwick, with his noble heart, is old and is rabid with indignation. It is hard to please everyone. You may remember that in my last letter I asked you to leave out about the wheel denudation. I told Jukes this, who was head man of the Irish Geological Survey, and he blamed me much, for he believed every word of it, and thought it not at all exaggerated. In fact, geologists have no means of gauging the infinitude of past times. There has been one prodigy of a review, namely an opposed one by Pictet, the paleontologist in the Bibliothèque Universelle of Geneva, which is perfectly fair and just, and I agree to every word he says. Our only difference being that he attaches less weight to the argument in favor and more to the argument opposed than I do. Of all the opposed reviews, I think this one the only quite fair one, and I never expected to see one. Please observe that I do not class your review by any means as opposed, though you think so yourself. It has done me much good service ever to appear in that rank in my eyes. But I fear I shall weary you with so much about my book. I should rather think there was a good chance of my becoming the most egotistical man in all Europe. What a proud preeminence. Well, you have helped to make me so, and therefore you must forgive me if you can. My dear Gray, yours ever most gratefully, C. Darwin. You might notice that nothing stated there actually says that the reason is the feathers couldn't be explained. So what's the actual reason for this? Well, we can have it from Darwin himself in other places. Primarily, we can read about it in his less famous book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Chapter 8 is Principles of Sexual Selection, and in this chapter we come across this. We are, however, concerned only with sexual selection. This depends on the advantage which certain individuals have over others of the same sex and species, solely in respect to reproduction, when, as in the cases mentioned above, those two sexes differ in structure in relation to different habits of life, they have no doubt been modified through natural selection, and by inheritance limited to one and the same sex. So again, the primary sexual organs, and those for nourishing or protecting the young, come under the same influence. For those individuals which generated or nourished their offspring best would leave, ceteris paribus, the greatest number to inherit their superiority, whilst those which generated or nourished their offspring badly would leave but few to inherit their weaker powers. As the male has to find the female, he requires organs of sense and locomotion, but if these organs are necessary for other purposes of life, as is generally the case, they will have been developed through natural selection. When the male has found the female, he sometimes absolutely requires prehensile organs to hold her. Thus Dr. Wallace informs me that the males of certain moths cannot unite with females if their tarsi or feet are broken. The males of many oceanic crustaceans, when adult, have their legs and antennae modified in an extraordinary manner for the prehension of the female. Hence we may suspect that it is because these animals are washed about by the waves of the open sea that they require these organs in order to propagate their kind, and if so, their development has been the result of ordinary or natural selection. Some animals extremely low on the scale have been modified for the same purpose. Thus the males of certain parasitic worms, when fully grown, have the lower surface of the terminal part of their bodies roughened like a rasp, and with this they coil around permanently and hold the females. M. Perrier advances this clause, Revue Scientifique, February 1st, 1873, page 865, as one fatal to the belief in sexual selection, inasmuch as he supposes that I attribute all differences between the sexes to sexual selection. This distinguished naturalist, therefore, like so many other Frenchmen, has not taken the trouble to understand even the first principles of sexual selection. An English naturalist insists that the claspers of certain male animals could not have been developed through the choice of the female. Had I not met with this remark, I should not have thought it possible for anyone to have read this chapter and to have imagined that I maintain that the choice of the female has anything to do with the development of prehensile organs in the male. Throughout this book, the peacock is mentioned as a previous source of confusion that is now clearly an example of sexual selection. This edition of the book is the second and was published 1874. The original edition is from 1871. So 11 years after the letter to Asa Gray, Darwin had figured out what was puzzling him about the peacock. But it wasn't that feathers are too complex. Darwin never thought that, and if you want to claim he did, then find where he expresses it, because I've tried, and despite the entire corpus of his published work, and even private letters, being searchable online, I couldn't find it. So it's time for creationists to put up or shut up on this one.
So that's really sad, isn't it?
I'm not sure what about Darwin figuring out the puzzle of the peacock's fantail is sad. He managed to do it with far less information and technology than we have now, and he was right. And sexual selection remains the consensus view of how such things occur. And not just among real scientists, but even among most creationists, who would say that the peafowl, the turkey, and the chicken all have a common ancestor. So such outrageous ornamentation was unlikely to be shared in the common ancestor of them. Therefore, it was a result of sexual selection in the peafowl lineage.
You know, for us, we look at a peacock feather or any other beautiful created thing, and we automatically know what it means. It was designed, it has an author.
Not if you want to hold on to the whole created kinds thing. And yet, he still didn't say anything about sexual selection. Weird, isn't it?
How tragic that for him, it just revolted him.
It didn't in 1871, so that's a happy ending. Make sure you tip extra for that one, John. But that's it for that whole topic. No actual real point, just pretending Darwin never figured out peacocks.
Darwin was wrong about natural selection. Well, how could that be? That's what he's famous for.
I'm sure Sanford will tell us how that could be by blatant lies about sources that I can easily check on, or in some cases, already know off the top of my head, like with The Descent of Man.
Well, we're going to see how that can be.
Bring it on.
Let's go.
So Darwin's magical selection was a little bit like, for him, he didn't know what was being selected. He didn't know about genes or mutations.
He didn't need to, because selection takes place upstream of genes, at the level of traits, and traits are observable without reference to the actual genes. That's how Mendel was able to detect the underlying rules of inheritance that are the results of genes by carefully measuring and tracking traits. But also, since natural selection is still a major part of evolutionary biology, maybe instead of hearing about how someone in the middle of the 19th century didn't take genes into account, we should hear about how people today still don't know about them. And that's why they believe in evolution. Except, oh wait, evolutionary biologists very obviously do know about genes, and they measure genetic evolution directly, and can see the effects of selection on traits directly in the genomes of organisms. Ouch. That's gotta suck. I can kind of see why Sanford would rather talk about Darwin, a topic that doesn't really matter, instead of having to contend with the fact that basically all of science says he's wrong about basically everything, basically all of the time.
And he didn't know about population genetics.
Fortunately, we know about it today.
So he had a very vague notion of what was happening. But for him, it was almost a magical wand.
Remind me, what's magical about the idea that traits can affect reproductive success? The idea that traits are heritable, and the idea that traits vary in any reproducing population. I can't see anything magical, but those ideas are the whole basis for natural selection. Sounds a lot less like a magical wand and more of a mathematical and logical inevitability.
The type of wand that could turn a frog into a prince.
Okay, I know this isn't a Tuesday night stream, but that joke was bad enough for me to go drink. So let me go down a few gallons of rum and come back.
And so let's just examine this thing. Natural selection is kind of a misnomer. You have to understand select. To select is a verb. It implies an intelligent selector. To select something requires intelligence.
Oh, God, Ma! Look! Little Johnny here done figured out that sometimes humans personify non-personal things to make it easier to talk about. Huh? What's that? Nah, I don't think he's realized it don't mean that they can't figure out it's just a metaphor. He seems to think it means they worship nature or some such. Yeah, I guess he's pretty stupid after all.
Of course, in nature, there is no intelligent selector. Mother Nature isn't a person. She's an allegory or a metaphor.
Little Johnny figured it out.
And so what's really happening in nature is there is differential reproduction. What do I mean by that? I mean, some things reproduce more than others. Which isn't very remarkable.
Let's give him a gold star. You know, he's right. It's not. And yet it's basically all you need for natural selection to operate. You toss in mutation, and you're off to the races with evolution.
But if you have something really defective, it's not going to reproduce well, and if you have really something super, it will produce more than normal. And that explains some things, but not very much.
Which is why Darwin had to think pretty hard about the peacock.
And so we're going to look at that. Let's just consider this process of adaptation, what some people would call microevolution.
No, adaptations is also part of microevolution. Microevolution is just evolution below the level of species, and macroevolution is just evolution above that level. So if any part of adaptation leads to a speciation event, then guess what? It's macroevolution.
Adaptation is a way to keep a species from changing.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
When organisms enter a new environment, they adapt to it. We've seen this in real time in the Lenski experiment. Fitness increased over the course of that experiment via verifiable mutations that cause observable changes in traits.
Let's consider the finch. Okay, Darwin's finches are a beautiful example of how one organism can be fine-tuned, changed just a little bit, so that it remains well-adjusted to its environment and can continue to be a finch.
Of course they're still tanagers, because remember, they're not finches in the family Fringillidae, they're tanagers in the family Anthropidae. But that's just monophyly, a requirement for evolution. But they certainly didn't stay the same. They're in 5 different genera with 19 different species between them. That's not adaptation keeping them the same. If that's what adaptation did, then there'd be one monospecific genus, and that's it.
You see that? The adaptation keeps the finch being a finch rather than dying off.
No, monophyly, that is that you can't escape your ancestry, keeps them tanagers. Adaptation keeps them from going extinct. 2 separate things.
So that's great. Adaptation is wonderful, and it's good design.
If you're going to say that that's design, you're going to have to actually back that up with some kind of citation.
But it's really important to understand that this doesn't require any new information. You don't need a new gene to change beak size. A single letter mutation in the genome is enough to change something like that.
Oh, and that's not new information. Why? Do we have a measurement for how much information a mutation creates or deletes, or how much total information is in a genome? No, we don't. Then I don't care what anyone has to say about information. Until you can quantify it, this is just a weasel word that means nothing. But it sounds like something people intuitively understand. It's just word games. It's dishonest, it's stupid, and again, it's frankly disgusting. If there were any truth to Sanford's ideas about evolution, he wouldn't need to resort to lying about sources and literal nonsense about information. That is, things about information that don't actually count as coherent thoughts. Remember, if you don't have any idea what something is, you can't really think about it. And creationists can never define information, which means they can't really think about it, which means they don't actually have coherent ideas about it, which means it's all nonsense in the strict sense of that word.
But the basic genome of the bird is the same, the basic design of the bird is the same. It's just a tweaking. It's like getting your, having your car tuned up.
Okay, so the basic genome of all apes is the same. I guess humans really are apes. Oh, wait. You mean this argument, in addition to being incoherent, fails to actually establish the points young Earth creationism needs it to? Well, darn. Looks like it's both dishonest and useless even if you ignore the dishonesty. Oh well.
So that happens, and so what do we say to adaptation? We give it a great big yes. It happens all the time. It's awesome. It explains how organisms become fine-tuned to their environment.
Resulting in speciation in many cases, which is what macroevolution actually is, and is all that's really required to get common ancestry. And you know who shares common ancestry? My subscribers. So if you want to join this family, just subscribe with the button below this video, and if you really want to, turn on all notifications with the bell icon. It would really help out the channel, as the more subscribers I have, the more views I get, the more I get discovered, and because I need things like food and shelter, the more this channel can support itself.
So let's see what Darwin does with this. Here's a quote from Darwin. "Slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do much by his powers of artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change. I can see no limit to the amount of change which may be affected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection.
Cool, and since Sanford imagines there's a limit, I'm sure he'll give us what causes that limit, and where the limit is, and what happens if a population were to reach that limit. Okay, audience, I can hear you thinking that there's no way he'll do that. I have to say, just because he's lied about basically everything so far, doesn't mean now isn't the time he'll pull through a win. You have to believe. Like Sanford believes that Noah was both immune to plasma burns and radiation sickness.
So there's a name for this. It's a scientific mistake. It's called extrapolation. And it's not just scientists know extrapolation is dangerous. They're very careful not to do it very much. And if they do it little.
Yeah, in cases where there is obviously evidence that simple extrapolation will not work because there are mechanisms that prevent the process from carrying on at the observed rate indefinitely, like population growth, the changes in brightness of the sun, the change in the strength of the Earth's magnetosphere, the accumulation of dissolved salts in the ocean. Oh wait, sorry. Those are all things young Earth creationists stupidly extrapolate infinitely into the past in a pathetic attempt to show that the Earth is really 750,000 times younger than we all know it to be. Oops. Well, let's give some examples of when it is appropriate, since there is no barrier or mechanism to change the process. Things like mutation accumulation over phylogenetic time, the expansion of the universe, and radioactive decay. Oh, my bad again. Those are all things creationists like to say can't be extrapolated without ever giving reasons besides that it makes them wrong. It's almost like creationism likes to do the exact opposite of what is scientifically plausible. Because get this, young Earth creationism is obviously wrong, and most of them know it.
This is what's called unbounded extrapolation. Scientists know that's always, always bad science.
Is it? Because there's good reason to think that there is no limiting mechanism or good evidence to think that there can be, and the process is going on at a predictable rate, then it actually makes a lot of sense. Now, feel free to come up with a mechanism that prevents the extrapolation beyond a point, but until you do so, scientists will keep on accepting the Big Bang, radiometric dating, and evolution.
He's saying, well, if you have no, let me give you an example. My daughter, when she was a young teen, was growing an inch a year. And so it's risky, but I could say, well, next year I'll bet she's going to be an inch taller. That's a modest level. That's careful, cautious extrapolation.
Which is warranted in terms of not being extended beyond certain limits, because we know that human bone growth plates close, and we have careful measurements of human height from around the world for centuries, and we can simply observe that human growth slows and comes to a halt at a certain point. So now I'm sure we're just about to get to analogous measurements and limiting factors in terms of mutation and selection.
Now let's use this type of extrapolation. In a million years, she's going to be 1,000,000 inches taller.
Yup, we know. That's dumb for all the reasons already explained.
Do you see that? It leads you immediately into absurdity, doesn't it? So he used a lot of extrapolation. Specifically, he said, since microevolution happens...
Actually, both Sanford and he use examples of macroevolution. Because it's nice that by not defining those terms, Sanford can just pretend that Darwin and he don't both agree on this. I think that's an intentional attempt to deceive the persons in his audience. Let's check what the definition of a lie is again. Merriam-Webster says that as an intransitive verb, it means 1. To make an untrue statement with intent to deceive, or 2. To create a false or misleading impression, and as a noun, 1a, an assertion of something known or believed by the speaker or writer to be untrue with intent to deceive, 1b, an untrue or inaccurate statement that may or may not be believed true by the speaker or writer, and 2, something that misleads or deceives. So, pretty conclusive that Johnny Boy here is lying by multiple definitions.
There's no limit to what it can accomplish. So let's consider that. No limit to change. So did you know that Darwin believed that a bear could evolve into a whale?
No, I don't know that, because that's impossible to know, because he never said that. He said that he saw no reason a bear could not turn into something as monstrous as a whale. That's not the same thing as a bear turning into an actual whale, and I can't imagine Sanford doesn't know the difference.
Let's just read a quote from Charles Darwin from his first edition of The Origin of Species.
Yeah, why bother with that pesky 6th edition when many of the points Sanford has made were already invalidated? We wouldn't want to be honest in our critique of a historical figure who plays essentially no part in evolutionary biology now, would we?
I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more aquatic in their structure and habits with larger and larger mouths till the creature was produced as monstrous as a whale.
Right. which in no way is Darwin saying bears could become whales, but that they could evolve to become whale-like in habitat and size.
See, I see no difficulty in that. Why does he say that? Because he didn't know anything about genetics.
Oh, cool, so we're going to hear about genetic barriers to bears getting bigger.
Because he knew almost nothing about biology. So in his imagination, he could see that. But you see, that's not evidence, and that's not science. That's just a good story.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll hear about the problem with this story any minute now.
To change a bear into a whale requires a lot of new genetic information. In fact, you have to rewrite the genome.
Well, we don't know what genetic information is or how to measure it, so that's a nonsense statement, but also not really giving us why bears couldn't become big and aquatic, which is weird because basically an elephant seal is a big aquatic bear. I mean, not quite, but it's pretty darn close. Seals and bears are quite closely related, and you can even see it in their extremely similar skulls, but also, their genetics. But also, what rewriting has to be done? Whales are artiodactyls, and their genomes aren't radically different from their closest relatives, the hippopotamus. So if bears needed a rewrite to become big swimmy boys, even though that isn't what happened with pinnipeds, why didn't whales need it?
And guess what? That is, for many, I'm a geneticist, and I don't want to go through all the details, but I just want you to understand that's not even remotely conceivable.
Oh, hell. The source is literally, I'm smart, trust me, bro. Well, guess what? I don't trust Sanford because he has done almost nothing but lie to my face this entire time. Why in the world would I trust him? I wouldn't trust him to go pick up carrots at the store, never mind give me a reasonable explanation of the alleged genetic problems with whale evolution.
Okay, so Darwin was wrong about natural selection. Yes, selection happens, but it's very limited, actually, what it can do. It generally just achieves fine-tuning to keep an organism going the way it was.
Source? He made it up.
It helps to preserve, but cannot create life forms. That is, it can slow down, by getting rid of the worst mutations in a population, it can prevent the extinction of species for a time.
Ooh, my Diny sense is tingling. I can feel the genetic entropy coming up.
But it cannot create new life forms. And most importantly, my own research from the last 12 years show that selection cannot stop genetic degeneration.
And there it is.
That means evolution's going the wrong way. And I'd just like to talk a little bit more about that. Why can't selection stop degeneration?
Because that's not a real thing. So same reason steel can't stop Superman, yet no one worries about that.
Let me just use the human population as an example. Human mutation rate is about 100 to 200 new mutations per person per generation. That means you have about 100 more mutations than your parents, and your children will have about 100 more mutations than you have.
But not 200 more than their grandparents. You see, mutations don't accumulate in populations at the same rate at which they occur. For this to be the case, every mutation that ever occurred in anyone would have to end up in everyone's genome. We know that doesn't happen for both theoretical and empirical reasons. Let's go over some of the theoretical reasons. Well, obviously, if a mutation occurs in a somatic cell and not a germline cell, it won't be passed on, but it will sure show up when you do a DNA swab from mom and daughter, since, DNA tests aren't usually done by sampling people's gonads. Natural selection will weed out some of the new mutations, since, that's what it does. Genetic drift also tells us that the rarer a genetic variation is, the less likely it is to be passed on than a more common one, simply because that's how the math works. This means that new mutations start out likely to go away, even if they're not specifically selected against. So, does this actually mean that in real life the rate at which genomes diverge is measurably lower than the mutation rate? Well, yes it does. In historical times, the island of Tristan da Cunha was settled by a small number of people from Great Britain. There has been enough time for measurable divergence in the Y chromosomes on the island. And guess what? The rate of divergence is lower than the measured mutation rate from one generation to the next. How shocking.
And most mutations are deleterious, so you can see that's kind of a problem.
No, it's kind of a lie. Sanford's source for this is Moto Kimura, who himself said that Sanford is wrong. Most mutations are neutral, although not in response to Sanford.
And you can see that maybe if these people are a little more mutant than these people, if we select away these people are still about 100 more mutations more mutant than their parents. Can you see that selection doesn't stop this problem?
Yeah, I can see that it doesn't stop mutation or mutation accumulation. Good thing everyone, including Kimura, realizes that this isn't a problem.
And so it's a real problem, and it's acknowledged by other population geneticists.
Yeah, like Robert Carter, whom I've already covered and who did no better than Sanford, is doing here. Weird, though, how no actual scientists take it seriously.
And it's made worse by this fact. Almost all mutations are deleterious and they have a tiny effect.
Deleterious means has a negative impact on differential reproduction in the current environment. Remember that for later, and we won't again point out that most mutations are actually completely neutral.
You know, if you have 3 billion letters, you can take away one letter, you've lost some information, but not much.
Oh, okay, so information is just how many nucleotides a genome has. That's cool. Maize has more information than rice, which has more than frogs, which has more than salamanders, which have more than humans, who have more than mice. I mean, I guess that works, but it also means that any mutation that increases the size of a genome counts as adding new information, and that happens all the time.
And so the typical mutation has no visible effect. It's deleterious, it's destroyed information, but no visible effect. Even Mother Nature can't see that effect.
Then it's not deleterious. Because remember how I said earlier that this would come up? Yeah. See, the thing is that in order to make this genetic entropy argument make sense, Sanford has to make up a new definition for fitness that has nothing to do with evolution. He might as well say that all mutation builds up grapple-dung in an organism, and then once it has too much grapple-dung, that's it. The organism dies. Don't ask him to bother saying why grapple-dung matters. And since no one has ever heard of it, there's no reason for anyone to think it matters.
And so it can't be selected away.
If natural selection can't select it away, then by definition it didn't have an impact on reproductive output, which means it definitionally can't be said to be deleterious. Some human might not personally like the mutation, but science isn't about that.
And so this is a profound problem, and it's similar to the problem with beneficials. Beneficials are like typographical errors in a text that make the text better. Do you see that would be unusual? That'd be rare?
Unusual, but even according to Sanford's own source, so overwhelmingly easy to select for that they achieve fixations so fast that he had to ignore them to take a look at neutral variation.
Almost infinitely rare?
Hey look, another blatant lie.
And so beneficials are too rare to measure how rare they are. That's how rare they are.
Weird, because numerous papers in the long-term Lenski E. coli experiment have measured beneficial mutation. To reverse this, it would be like telling Sanford Christianity can't be true because everything in the Bible is historically false. We know that's not true. We know there was a Babylonian exile. We know that afterwards a temple was built. We know that there was a king named David. We know that there was a real King Herod and a real Pontius Pilate. Now, you could argue that that corroboration is insufficient to accept as true the totality of the story, including miracles, but it's dishonest to say that everything about the Bible is false. Similarly, Sanford could say that beneficial mutations as actually measured are insufficient. At least that way he'd just be wrong, not lying.
So, and like deleterious mutations, they are, if you add one letter to a genome of 3 billion, it's not going to dramatically increase the information in that genome, will it?
More evidence that genetic information is, in Sanford's estimation, simply genome length.
So you see, the beneficial mutations are not going to be able to accumulate fast enough to counterbalance all the bad mutations that are happening.
I'm just over here looking at the long-term rise in fitness in the Lenski experiment, and I'm over here looking at the paleogenomic data that doesn't seem to show some perfect or even objectively better genome in organisms in the past. In fact, recently a paleo-eDNA study was done that found reindeer DNA that's basal to all extant reindeer. Maybe Sanford would like to make predictions about how it should look based on his genetic degradation, and then look at the DNA from that study and see if they match.
So the bottom line is genetic degeneration can't be stopped. Unless there's some unknown mechanism we have not yet discovered, genomes should degenerate. They should go down, not up.
I agree, it can't be stopped, but in the way that I can't stop Gandalf the Grey. Not because he's so unavoidable and powerful, but because he doesn't exist to be stopped.
And that's profound, really, really profound. And if someone can figure out how to stop that, let me know, because I'd really like to know.
Since it's literally never observed anywhere and is mathematically impossible, I'd just say don't worry about it there, Johnny.
So we used, in the last 7 years, I've worked with a team of scientists, and we've developed the most advanced, what's called numerical simulation, or computer program that simulates this problem of mutation accumulation.
Wow, you put together a sophisticated computer model based on your bad and obviously wrong assumptions. Let me guess, it supported your conclusion. By the way, it's called Mendel's accountant, for those of you who care.
Even with selection and recombination and all the thing, basically modeling how in real life...
well, in real life, genetic entropy doesn't occur, so...
mutation and selection should happen. And just briefly, We find with our numerical simulations that more than 90% of bad mutations are not selected away. They just keep accumulating like rust on your car.
Wow, that sounds really bad for the poor hypothetical organisms in the simulation you wrote to prove your own ideas. Got any evidence that reflects the real world? No? Weird.
And we find that the rare beneficials have almost no effect on the scenario, even if we crank up the mutation rate of beneficials. And what we find is that fitness continuously declines in our simulations, and we see that extinction in these runs is inevitable.
Oh, cool, because in actual experiments with real organisms, that's not what happens. And we know because, rather than just writing a computer program that conveniently spits out the expected answer based on dumb assumptions, Richard Lenski just actually took real organisms and put them in an unusual environment and has been keeping track of their evolution for decades. He's seen fitness increases and no trend towards extinction. The best creationists have done to counter this, as far as I can see, is point out that many lines of the experimental bacterium have higher than wild-type mortality rates. That's true. If you total up the number of bacteria that die per unit time, it's higher. But that's because, they reproduce more in that environment, so there are way more of them. So of course, more of them die. That's like pointing out that more humans die per day in AD 2023 than did in AD 420. Well, yeah, in 2023 the population is over 8 billion. In 420 it was less than 200 million.
And so Mendel's Accountant is a program that we use, and it's freely available. You can download it on the internet.
Here's a fun experiment. Download Mendel's Accountant and then get it to mimic the outcome of the Lenski experiment as reported in numerous papers, one of which I've linked in the sources. It's sustained fitness gains and variability in fitness trajectories in the long-term evolution experiment with Escherichia coli by Lenski et al., published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Biological Sciences on December 22, 2015. Just the title poses a problem for Mendel's Accountant, by the way.
So here's just two quick illustrations for you. The first one shows that the red line shows the number of mutations that are accumulating goes up linearly through time. So we're going through about 250, a little over 250 generations are passing during this experiment.
Okay, so I'm expected to believe that mutations have fixed fitness effect, which is completely wrong. That neutral mutations simply don't accumulate, despite being the majority of mutations, and despite the majority of the genome of all organisms being non-sequence constrained, and that mutations can't be weeded out by natural selection, despite being deleterious, which means selected out by natural selection. Why is it that even the supposedly most sophisticated creationist claims are the kind of thing you realize don't work with just paying attention in a freshman biology course?
And the bad mutations are accumulating to very high numbers, to up to tens of thousands of mutations per person. Whereas the good mutations, even though we put in one out of every 10 mutation is beneficial, which is radically too high, we see that the good mutations are accumulating, even with natural selection, much more slowly than the bad mutations.
Which is at odds with observed reality, meaning that the simulation is worthless. That's how you test a simulation. Does it give realistic results when tested with realistic settings mimicking known events? If it can come up with results broadly similar to real life, then it's a good simulation. If it can't, well then, it's a bad simulation, no matter how sophisticated it is or how many lines of code it has.
And so what we see in the same run, same experiment, is that the fitness goes down precipitously, and the blue line, which is population size, crashes at the end, and the population goes extinct.
I just wanted to remind everyone of the title of that 2015 paper by Lenski et al. It was Sustained Fitness Gains and Variability in Fitness Trajectories in the Long-Term Evolution Experiment with Escherichia coli. No reason I wanted to say that, just thought it would be fun for everyone to remember what the paper describing a real-world test of this hypothesis was called.
Population goes extinct in just 268 generations. And these are settings that we feel are very realistic.
Wow, fruit flies have a generation time of 12 days at the long end. So if this were accurate, fruit flies would have about 3,216 days before they're too entropy to exist. That's less than 9 years. So if any of my audience are more than 9, they've watched fruit flies go through so much genetic entropy that they should be extinct. If you're 18, you've seen this happen twice over. Does God have a divine fruit fly factory pumping up perfect fruit flies? If Mendel's accountant is accurate, he must. But hey, let's give him a free order of magnitude. I mean, he is a young Earth creationist, and we like to give them a free order of magnitude just to be nice. So now the predicted shelf life of fruit flies is just over 88 years. Now, not much of my audience is that old, but luckily the record of fruit fly experiments in science goes back to 1910, which is over a century ago at the time of this writing. More than enough time for us to be out of fruit flies, assuming the 1910 variety were perfect divine fruit flies that God just created then. See how this really doesn't work if you think about it for any time at all?
We can change the settings and delay the extinction, but we can't, unless we go to totally dishonest settings, we cannot stop it. It means, what does it mean?
It means he told a computer to make him feel smart by unrealistically mimicking his expectations. And he patted himself on the back because now the doom of humanity is close at hand, but he thinks Jesus will come to save him before that, so it's okay. It also means he doesn't actually care if he's right because he's never bothered to actually compare his computer results against real-world results. Or if he has, he's just lying about the whole thing, which, unlike in other parts of the speech, I'm not quite ready to say.
It means that genetic systems, like everything else, is subject to entropy.
Entropy is the statistical fact that in isolated systems, the capacity of a system to perform work, as defined by displacement of matter, goes down or stays the same. It is not some vague idea that disorder goes up. Order does not map onto entropy in the real world, and pretending it does or that evolution somehow violates the second law of thermodynamics is just to show that you don't know what entropy is. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I don't think Sanford could reliably tell anyone what the units are that are used to measure entropy in the first place.
And the genetic systems are running down even with natural selection. And so, bottom line, there's genetic change over time. If that's your definition of evolution, genetic change over time, I am totally a believer in evolution.
Well, evolution is at minimum a change in allele frequency across generations in a reproducing population. So yes, he does believe in evolution.
But the problem is it's the evolution down, not up.
Citation needed, Lodwidge.
And so that's profound, and I think that that's something we can very rigorously prove to any reasonable person.
Weird then how the scientific consensus is that these ideas are hilariously stupid and not worth the paper they're printed on. Must be a vast conspiracy.
So now we're to the end, and we come back to the issue of Darwin was wrong.
And I'm back to the point that Darwin isn't Pope of science. He's not the prophet of evolution. It doesn't matter if he's wrong. It matters what's happening in current science, which has a lot more data to work from than he did.
He was wrong about the science, but most importantly, he was wrong about God. So let's consider his life. He won fame like no other person except Christ, perhaps, and Muhammad.
So the Buddha doesn't count? Plato? Confucius? Newton? Einstein? Forget about them, I guess.
For 150 years, the whole world has bowed down to Darwin.
Wait, have I not been invited to the Darwin worship services? You guys, why didn't you tell me about this? I am not okay with being left out like this.
You know, Hitler was famous for a decade.
Yeah, and that's where you're fucking done, Sanford. We're not going to sit here and compare Darwin and the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in any way, even in their level of fame or notoriety. Man, what a piece of shit Sanford is. And I came to this thinking I'd like him reasonably well. You know, like how I rather like Todd Wood. I've also recently heard that Sanford wouldn't be interested in perhaps explaining himself about this. So I also have to assume that he's a coward, in addition to being an obvious liar. I guess we can add Sanford to the list of Meyer and Stelling in terms of blatantly mendacious creationist hacks. Oh well, if you liked this video, hit like and leave a comment telling me what you liked. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and tell me why not in the comments. Either way, I hope you subscribe and use the notification bell to turn on all notifications, so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Van Tovent, Tapioca Weasel, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Elleran Teller, and Pat L. Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.